Hi, everyone. I'm Tarja from Action for Results. And today I have brought two colleagues of mine from Action for Results to have a conversation before the end of the year because I've been traveling in Europe visiting some of our customers. And I also had a chance to visit several customers in the United States before I left. And interestingly enough, the one topic that keeps coming up over and over again is something called QMSR, which has a date associated with it and lots of hype going on. So I asked our Vice President of Quality, Mahshid Zahed, as well as our Senior Regulatory Affairs Consultant, Elizabeth George, or Beth as I call her, to join me today to kind of untangle this thing. What is QMSR and what is this hype all about? Mahshid, welcome. Beth, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get right to the conversation about QMSR. What exactly is QMSR and what is all this hype about? Mahshid, can you start with that?
Definitely, Tarja. I would like to give maybe a brief explanation of some of the key elements of the QMSR, and then we can then go into more details in some of the areas that definitely will be different than what we were known as QSR. So QMSR stands for Quality Management System Regulation. And if you see the difference, there is just the management piece that has been added. Before we used to have quality system regulation. Now we have the quality management system regulation. The reason that that differentiation has been created is because now FDA in February of 2024 actually issued a revision to the 820, 21 CFR 820, and changed the requirements to ISO 13485 2019. So if you think about how we used to have all these subsystems within the QSR, now those subsystems are becoming actually the ISO 13485. So every company that probably has production or products in Europe, the likelihood is that they understand what ISO 13485 is. However, if you are a domestic or a US-based company and you are not really having any CE mark product or certification to ISO 13485, it's going to be very different for you as to what you need to implement to meet the intent of the new QMSR regulation. So with that, what a lot of people ask the question of why? Why did FDA decide to all of a sudden change this? And the main reason for it is we are getting into more and more harmonization. The position that FDA has taken with regard to a QMSR is that the content may be a bit different, but the concept is the same. Still, we are applying quality system. However, we had very different terminology, very different approach. A good area where it would be risk management, very different way of putting documents together that maybe were equivalent in some ways to ISO 1385, but they weren't identical. So in order to allow companies to have an easier way of managing a product from start to the end, the entire life cycle, FDA decided that they are going to just take the ISO 13485 and make that the actual 820. So now we have a harmonized way of really designing, developing, manufacturing, distributing, storing product based on the same set of requirements. So that was the main reasons that FDA did this. Now, at the time when they did it, they sent it out, of course, for review and evaluation by many parts of the industry, and the regulators outside of even US helped in this process. But comments came from many companies, and many of those companies were the domestic companies, the local US-based companies. And there were 83 comments that came about, which I encourage all of you to go not just through the QMSR as the regulation, but also the preamble that talks about FDA's thinking through these 83 comments that they responded to. That's a very useful tool for those of you who are not maybe as familiar with ISO 13485. One other thing that I want to also make sure that you take into consideration as far as this change is the fact that all the definitions that we were used to may have changed because of the requirements of ISO, and all of those definitions are defined in ISO 9001. So again, make sure you review the ISO 9001 to understand that the definitions and the verbiage on some of the concepts have changed. And one area that definitely you want to focus on is the 10 definitions that FDA has left in QMSR that they were actually in QSR. So there are 10 definitions that are different from ISO 13485. Those are defined, but then everything else, we are now, sort of migrating to ISO 9001 definitions.
I think
so those are some of the key areas.
Yeah, we'll come back to some of the language and definitions because I have a lot of questions on that. I just have a really basic question in case somebody else has that based on just listening to you right now. Does this mean that design controls as we know it changes?
No, the design control really doesn't change. However, the way design control was in QSR, it was just one subsystem. When you look at QSR, they talk about design and development. So when you think about the design and development, there may be other aspects or other areas within design control that you may have to take into consideration. A good example of it would be post-market surveillance. We didn't have this requirement in the past that mandated the companies that you make improvements based on your product surveillance data. Yeah. In the QMSR, that's very clearly defined, that you are expected to look at product surveillance once you launch it, and then from there make the appropriate improvements. So that additional piece is for design and development.
So we'll come back to some of the changes, but Beth, can you just from the overarching perspective, does this mean now that submissions change, the requirements for submissions change? And what happens if I'm just about to submit? Because now this comes to effect on February 2nd, 2026, I think. Okay, so what happens if I'm working on my submission right now? Should I be working based on whatever is in the new requirements? How does that work?
So I'm going to start off with yes and no, because that's what regulatory people start always having their answers. It depends, right? We never answer with one answer. We have to have many answers. So first off, I want to say that generically, no, the submissions are not going to be impacted. The majority of the submissions, there's thousands every year that are in the 510K world. So the class 2, and even some cases, some class 1s also submit 510Ks. Those you're not going to see significant changes in anything that they're doing. And even if you have the old terminology in that 510K submission, the FDA is not going to suddenly say, oh, you used the wrong terminology. You called it a device master record instead of, what is it now? I always forget what the actual term. Yeah, well, that's the design one. So yeah, and then there's the development file and things like that. So, they're not going to ding you on that on your submission. That's because if they wasted their time on that, then they'd probably be missing the real concept of safety and effectiveness. Where they will focus some of that is in the PMA area, in the pre-market submission area, the formal pre-market submission. The good or bad news is there's not as many of those per year. There's usually only somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 pre-market approvals that are done per year. The manufacturer has the opportunity, leveraging what's already in the FDA's world, of defining the format that they're going to do for submissions. The format needs to include things like the manufacturing processes and all of that. So there is an expectation that you are going to define how your quality system is. And one of the key sections of a pre-market approval is defining the structure and format of your quality management system. And so you're going to want to identify those changes. You're going to want to have those addressed as soon as possible. And in fact, hopefully you have afforded yourself the opportunity to have a discussion with the FDA before you even start that submission, to get that defined strategy in place, to make sure that it's understood, and to make sure that you aren't all of a sudden at the 11th hour ready to have that final document submitted and have the FDA say, oh, by the way, you should have done this. You really should have identified that up front. I would suspect that if you are, again, as part of that discussion with the FDA, that you've talked to them, well, we're going to be submitting on February 3rd, the final document. Hopefully they will have already had that discussion with you to say, it's okay, we'll take it as is. Or they will have said, wow, you've submitted nothing and it's December, what's today, 19th. You've just submitted nothing. So guess what? You better be in the new format and new structure. The records associated with that submission, however, you do not have to redo all the records. What you would do is in your early part of the quality management system section of the submission, as well as in your cover letter, you would communicate to the FDA that every place that we say design history record or device master record or whatever terminology you've used, it equates to this going forward, and make sure that they understand that. So there's not going to be that kind of change. Now, I know we're going to get into it a little bit more, but as Mahshid said, risk is going to be much more critical, and there's going to be a much more significant focus on the risk area. So I think that that's going to be something you're going to have to really see as the most significant change, particularly in the pre-market submission. The other area that is increasing their focus is in the supplier management area. And the FDA is going to be looking at that far more closely in those pre-market submissions, as well as during their inspections when they come in. They're going to have that ability to actually now look at your audit reports, your audit protocols, your audit and corrective actions, and all of that activity. In the past, if you remember, they looked at our audit schedules, they looked at our audit evidence that we executed, and then they only looked at the CAPAs that were the result of those audits, or the supplier corrective action reports that were the result of those audits. So they never actually looked at the formal report. And if we all know how reports are done, there's probably 20 or 30 additional comments and concerns and issues that are identified in an audit report that are not in a CAPA necessarily, because we as good quality and regulatory professionals say, okay, we understand that, we're going to take the actions. We can maybe handle them as a local or as a quick correction and don't need to have the full-blown CAPA or the full-blown action plan. So those are going to be some of the things that are going to be considered in that activity. And then lastly, I would say, as was mentioned earlier, is that just generally when you're working with the FDA, I mean, I'd like to go back a little bit to what Mahshid mentioned about the 2018 is when the FDA officially kicked off their discussion to switch to the ISO 13485. They didn't execute it until 2024. So you can see that it took them time. So they did a lot of discussion, a lot of thought process. They listened even upfront to us as industry that were actively involved. But I must tell you, they were actually involved way before that because they've been involved in Global Harmonization Task Force. They've been involved in the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And they are very, very actively involved in the standards development world in the group of the TC 210. And in fact, some of my old colleagues that I used to work for me and with me were lockstep with the FDA to help drive them towards this harmonization, because really they finally got it that why should the FDA have a separate document when the rest of the world is embracing ISO 13485?
And it would certainly make life a little easier, both from setting up your quality management system, but also obviously when you're making submissions happen and audits. So
Definitely.
one thing that I hear a lot in my travels is when I bring up the whole QMSR chains, those companies who already are 13485 certified say, well, it's not going to really, we find there's really nothing we really have to do. And I'm listening to the two of you in just the start of this conversation. I'm going like, there is something more they need to still do. Mahshid, what if you had to sort of summarize the critical things they should be looking at, given the changes, if they are already have the certification? Where do we start?
If you already have the certification, the likelihood is that you just need to focus on the terminology, and then focus also on the areas that in the past they weren't scrutinized by FDA to the extent that probably ISO 13485 assessors they were looking at. A good example of that, for instance, would be what Beth said, supplier controls. In the past, we really didn't have a lot of details about when you purchased a product, to what extent did you use the necessary information from the product development and design sense, and you relied really on your contractor. The likelihood is that now FDA is going to get much more scrutiny on looking at those documentation when they come to actually inspect you. Or, like Beth said, if they're doing a submission, the likelihood is that you need to provide a lot more data associated with what you did with supplier stuff in your documentation when you submit. So it's not that there is a lot more work that you have to do. The work probably was already there because you were ISO 13485, but now how you present it to the FDA, whether in an inspection or whether in a submission, will be a little bit different. Same will be with risk management data. Same would be things that are related to packaging and labeling. So there are definitely some areas that additional steps have to be taken from a presentation perspective, not necessarily the exact work that we have done when we are an ISO certified company.
So can I double click on the supplier from a different angle just for a little bit? We know that our world is no longer inside four walls when we do design and development these days. We have partners. We have partners in development. We have manufacturing partners. And we always have this conversation about who's the legal manufacturer, right?
Yeah.
And then there's these quality agreements that we need to have in place. Is that an area we have to scrutinize further as well, just based on what's happening right now? Beth,
you're gonna have to get more involved on the development side, whereas before you probably left a lot to the supplier.
Okay.
So that probably is going to be a bigger requirement.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. I think that the other thing that you have to do, those agreements, I ironically enough, just this week, I was looking at some supplier agreements. And one of the things I noticed is that the OEM was trying to allow the supplier to have a lot more of the decision-making process. and even some of the change control process, because they said, oh, well, those are not, they're not critical to the safety and effectiveness of the solution. And I always say to myself, well, how do you know that unless you have something that fails in that area? So I think that the OEMs are going to have to really clearly delineate why they feel that it's acceptable to allow a supplier to have full control and scrutiny on something. And if they do allow, and many times software is the area that is always one of those that causes lots of discussion. Oh, Microsoft isn't going to listen to me when I impose things on them as a supplier. Well, you're right, they're not. So that means you need to have some added controls when you get that software from them, or have that added scrutiny that you do on because of how you're going to use it. You're the only one that really understands the intended use. So supplier agreements are wonderful. Supplier agreements are invaluable. I would take the time to look at them. I also think that what many manufacturers have done is that they randomly classify or categorize the supplier as a high priority, low priority, off the shelf. They say, oh, well, Microsoft is off the shelf, therefore we don't have to do anything. Well, if you're embedding that software into a class 3 medical device, wrong answer. You better not say that, because the FDA will just have wonderful time with that. The other area that I do think, and I think you brought up specifically those manufacturers that have ISO 13485 already, but I think it's for everybody to understand. Management reviews now are going to be looked at much more heavily by the FDA than they've ever been, because the FDA didn't have the authority in the previous QSR to actually look at the content of the review. They could look at your agenda, they could look at the execution, they could look at the frequency, they could look at, those and they could look at the output. But a lot of companies have a tendency in their management review, they don't drive something to be a CAPA. They try to keep it as a locally managed in the management review, because they don't want to have the level of scrutiny or the level of blaming management for lack of management responsibility. And Mahshid and I have seen that in a number of cases that with clients that we've worked with is that, they say, yes, we're monitoring it. Well, you're now on your 6th management review and you're still in the red. That's an issue. And that probably should have been a CAPA, but they felt that they wanted to manage it locally. So I think that, those are areas that both the companies new to ISO 13485, as well as companies that have been using ISO 13485, may need to revisit how they manage their corrective actions and their issues that are escalated to senior management.
And put a little more rigor into the management reviews, probably. I see a future webinar coming up on just this topic. It's, because to me, some of these things that are built into our processes, we often kind of get lackadaisy about this. They dare, so we just kind of do the rote thing. We go through the motions, but what you're really talking about is added rigor. So the other place where you said rigor's going to really increase is in the risk management side. Mahshid, I know this is one of your favorite topics. What's going to be happening in terms of the risk management element, and how does it integrate with the rest in the design and development?
Well, the two terms or concepts we all have to become very familiar with. One is called risk-based approach. The other one is risk-based decision. So risk-based approach, to some extent, we are familiar with, because we know even in the QSR, when you were developing a product from a design, output perspective, you definitely had to do it based on risk. Or if you were doing any type of verification and validation, you definitely were using risk as a way of deciding to what extent. What is going to be different now is that this risk-based approach has to be put in place throughout the product lifecycle, which means when you're defining your design input, when you're defining your design output, when you are doing your entire verification and validation, and even going to tech transfer, right, or the actual product transfer to the manufacturing, and then manufacturing has to be taken into consideration. So everything you do in the life cycle of the product must be risk-based approach. Now, risk-based decision is more focused on the QMS side, the quality management system side. So one of the things that I want to make sure I sort of clarify is that role of the risk management, and this is specifically some conversation that I have taken with FDA, and this is the way FDA is thinking as far as role of risk management when we think about quality management system regulation. So I want to list those for you. One is that identify, assess, and communicate and review device risk to the quality management system processes. So every process that touches the product, which to be honest with you, if you really think about it, everything touches the product.
Yep.
All of that is going to become a part of this new risk management process that you have to implement. The other one they talk about is provide and reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness throughout total product lifecycle. Total product lifecycle. Again, is not just the piece that you do design, is across the entire, like Beth said, suppliers is going to be a big part of that product development or product design. Now you're going to have to take this risk-based approach toward that as well. And the other one,
one quick comment, Mahshid, one quick comment I wanted to add in there was the emphasis on total product life cycle. So you have to be thinking not only about, the design aspects, as she said, the manufacturing aspects, and the first couple years of its life, but you also have to think about the end of life and the end of service. And there's manufacturers traditionally have not done a very good job in that area. They'll say, oh, the product will last 3 years. Okay, well, what does that mean? What about servicing? What about, and the implications? And you have to encompass the risk. And if you say the product's going to last for 3 years, but you've got batteries that only last a year, and you've got software that every 3 months has got upgrades happening to it, you've got to encompass all of those elements in that risk approach and risk decision making. Yep. Sorry for the interruption.
Yep, that's a very good point. And again, that's what total, really product life cycle means. And then the last one that they said the role of the risk management is that provide a framework for sound decision making within a QMS. So again, a good example of those will be when you are, having you're like the software that Beth was talking about. Yeah, that software is not just the product software, is every software that you're using. What are you going to do to make sure that you make right approach from a perspective of the right software, the right validation, the right revalidation? So all of that becomes, again, a part of your decision making that has to be based on risk. So they are very clear now. Clear now that is across everything, not just product design.
So 2 questions. First one, just listening to all the halves too, right? There are a lot of things that aren't happening today. So does this mean that we overhauling our risk management procedure? I mean, how do we implement this particular rigor, right? And then also, how do we document this? I mean, is this being documented in the risk file? give a little bit more on what does this mean for organizations, because of course we have our risk management procedures separately, and then they integrated with with the design controls appropriately from a design and development process perspective. But now I'm trying to think about, do I have to redo my risk management approach
Is not
completely?
is not redoing, Tarja, is to make sure that we touch the concept of risk in all elements of
Yeah,
quality management system. So a good example of it will be when you are doing a CAPA,
yeah,
right? To what extent you do that CAPA is going to be based on risk.
yeah,
You have to have risk levels that says to what extent you're going to drive this CAPA to where it needs to be driven. Or
yeah,
when you are thinking about like management review, if you are sitting in a room as bunch of management and you're making a decision, you have to decide to what extent you are going to put time and effort and cost into something that probably is not going to have a major impact. But if it's
yeah,
a high impact, if it's a high risk, where you better make sure you do an appropriate assessment, documentation, evaluation, recording, all that is required to say how you came about to make
yeah.
this risk-based decision.
So this is significant,
One,
and it ties
yeah,
to
I think one of the
practice.
other things that, yeah, one of the other things that at least comes to mind for me when I think about all of this is, yes, there's enhancements that need to be done to the risk management activities, but the word risk needs to be thought about, as Mahshid said, all the time in
Yeah,
every activity that's done. And some of that may be, and I apologize for using this word, but we've used it many times, of it's a cultural shift. It
yeah,
is a cultural shift for people. You have to have a few people in the organization, you know, that, how the analogy of a bad apple destroys the whole bin. Well, we have to be like the bad apple that constantly brings up the word risk so that everybody starts to have that question. You have to
yeah,
have people that ask that question on every, why are we spending this money? Why are we doing this? Is this, is it easier to stop producing that product than to keep trying to design quality
yeah. I was
into it?
just,
Is
I
it,
was just kind of
you know,
that was my thought. I was listening to you is that this is a lot of this is about practice. It's asking the right questions, and potentially making pretty tough trade-offs as a result of asking those questions, right?
right,
Okay, so
right.
let's switch gears just a little bit. Right now, I'm looking at our time here and talk about time. Time is ticking. It's not going to be long before it's February. If I haven't started at all, if my company hasn't started yet at all, and I'm one of those who needs to, should I panic?
Well, you will have,
I would say it
again, it
depends.
goes back to whether you are ISO 13485 certified
Yeah,
or not. If
yeah,
you
Right.
are, the likelihood is that you have less panic in front of you. But if you are, again, someone, I mean, it's firm that hasn't gotten through certification, the likelihood is that you have a lot of work to do. One thing that I want to make sure that is very clear to everyone is that don't think that just because you have made a review of ISO 13485, you are going to be able to meet the expectation of the FDA. I want you to make sure that also you look at ISO 14971, which is the risk management standard. You have to make sure that's fully now incorporated into the QMSR. Point blank, the expectation is that. The other thing you need to think about, if you're a combination product, remember, combination product, if you have a device constituent part, this now applies to you. You must now apply 13485 and the QMSR. So don't forget that. The other one also I want to talk about is that if you are thinking about, okay, I'm just going to go ahead and look at the standards, good, we are good to go. No, make sure you look at again those 83 comments because you have very specific details as to what FDA expects. And then the other one you definitely have to become very familiar with is the ISO 13485, a practical guide. That practical guide is almost like a guidance document that we expect of FDA to come up when they roll something out. For ISO 13485, there is extensive, and I mean extensive, guidance documents that gives you what the intent of 13485 is. So don't just say, I'm going to look at, you got to do your gap analysis as to what you are not having based on all these different standards and topics that I talked about here.
Very good. And so you've
I would
listed.
I would also say, Tarja, that one of the key things is it does depend where you are in that transition, if you're somebody that is ISO versus not. But one of the key areas is even if you are ISO, I think it's going to be critical to understand two very key things. One is to train your management and all of the staff in those deltas, particularly when there's an inspection with the FDA, to understand. Because the last thing you want to do is have some quality person, because I've had clients recently, I had somebody say, well, I don't have to get, I looked at their management review, I told them what was a gap, and they said, oh, yeah, but I don't have to give them that. I'm like, yes, you do. Yeah, because if you go and tell the FDA inspector you don't, that's going to be an observation. But the other thing is I think that you have to understand those comments and understand the challenges and have some experts that partner with you to make sure that your interpretation is correct. Because just because, as we well know, if somebody's never been audited by the FDA, well, guess what? The FDA is going to have to go to a new audit strategy here. They have not committed one way or another whether they're going to be using MDSAP, even though they are a part of the MDSAP program, the Medical Device Single Audit Program under IMDRF. They have not committed that. They used to still follow their QSIT program even though they were a part of MDSAP. So we believe, based on the knowledge that we have in shitty chatting with some of our colleagues at FDA, that they are developing a specific audit strategy. We believe they've already started training some of those auditors. So those auditors are going to be newbies to ISO 13485 too. So guess what? If you as a manufacturer don't have somebody that's knowledgeable in all of those things that Mahshid mentioned, the standard, the preamble, all the guidance documents, you may be setting precedent by giving things or not giving things that the FDA is asking for. So you better make sure that you're at least as knowledgeable as the FDA in this, if not more so.
That's good advice. And I think, you guys have now mentioned several references that are really, really important, probably, to be studying. And we'll make sure that list is available for anybody who's listening to this. I've also asked that you will pair up and give a little bit of a guidance document that we can give to our customers, and that'll be available on our website as well in January. Of course, we are here, obviously. So if somebody is having that moment of panic, that's a good time to call us, and maybe we can calm down. We can be the calming factor, but at the same time, the work has to be done, right? Okay, I'm going to take you just a little bit into a different place, because something just hit me as I was listening to this, all of this conversation around standardization, harmonization. That makes sense, right? But so now I work, because we all work with a lot of these large companies that have legacy systems. And so one company might have 9, 11, or at least 2 different quality management systems. And now, the world is, from the regulations perspective, is starting to harmonize. Should companies be harmonizing their quality management systems the same way. And then also, if I am doing a QMSR update and I have multiple quality management systems, multiple design control systems, multiple risk management procedures, do you have any advice what to do in that situation? Because I can't just up and just change all my quality management systems into one quality management system all at once. But what should I do?
So, Tarja, I can tell you this, that from the perspective of FDA, I can use two examples. One is when I was at Baxter, when we were under consent decree, and it became very evident that even though the consent decree was related to one division, one product,
Yeah.
the FDA expectation was, how do I know that your other divisions or your other products don't have the same issues? If you don't have a harmonized system, if you don't have a same way of managing your quality system or your quality assurance or your quality control, how do I know the same doesn't exist? Just because I haven't found it, that doesn't mean you're doing okay. So the more you think about harmonization, is going to be easier for you to defend your position.
Sure.
With regard to when there is a scenario that probably you are not compliant. The other example is I can think of J&J. J&J, in many ways, they thought by having subsidiaries and these subsidiaries on their own, focusing on their work and having their own quality management system and everything, J&J would have never gotten into trouble. Whole and behold, they got the biggest 483, the biggest warning letter, and then ultimately they were fined, I don't know, I think it was $70 million. I may be wrong in the number of the dollar, but it was a big chunk of money. And the position that FDA took with them was exactly the same. You are one company, not 50 subsidiaries, right?
But that's such a so makes a little sense on one hand. To think about this, one company should have one system, one process, right? However, it's hard in real life, right? Because if you think about our industry, it's full of mergers and acquisitions. So we start with this, we are one company, and then the next thing, we growing and we acquiring another one, and they come with their systems, and the faster we grow, the harder it becomes. And I think that's how we end up with these multiple quality management systems. So is there a wisdom in this conversation about what do we do when we go acquisition way?
Yeah, and I was going to add on to what Mahshid said, and I'll address both of those. That I 100% agree with Mahshid. I have experience with a number of companies. I was at Philips, very similar stories of what she just described, and the like. But what I would say is that I think it's important to have, as a minimum at a company, policies that are well defined, that are well rolled out, and that are well embraced by all of the different divisions, all of the different acquisitions, et cetera. Then what you would do is maybe by, and I'm going to say elements or quality system element, whatever category, section of 4A, that you decide at what level, and think about what Mahshid said earlier, risk-based. You look at something at a risk base and you say, this particular process, and let's say the CAPA tool or the complaint tool, you want to go from top to bottom. You want it harmonized. You want it 100% identical. You don't want anything different.
Yeah.
Another area might be user labeling. The labeling of the product. So who better than customers want to know that you're one company, right? But
absolutely.
You may have something else that only goes down to, say, a top level procedure, say design controls, because guess what? Software is very different than a disposable, than an implantable. So at
Yeah.
the next level down, maybe you have some differentiation.
So think
I think
strategically, but
also
start. Yeah. Right.
yes, yeah. And then I think the other challenge, as you mentioned, is mergers and acquisitions. And the reason that companies have that problem is they do not have a well-defined quality system process that says how they decide to make a merger or an acquisition. They don't have an assessment process to look at, is this company even a quality company? They don't have an integration process. They don't put together a plan that says, what's the timeline for this integration? They don't have a well-defined quality plan that says, what that timeline and how you're going to do it. So those are the areas why we end up where we end up. And I can tell you, I was at Philips while I was there, and I was one of the acquired companies when I was there. They did 40 acquisitions in like a 5-year period.
Yeah.
And I can tell you the ones that went really well, and I can tell you the ones that went horribly. And the ones that went really well, it was because we had a well-defined plan, a well-defined process, and a well-defined decision-making with leadership that was driving it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for those comments. And I definitely, I'm going to bring you both back because now I can already think of many different questions. But we're going to finish for today. And before I ask you for your final thought, is there anything else that we haven't yet talked about that would be critical for people to know about just what is within this QMSR chains? Have we hit all the highlights?
One thing I want to make sure that Tarja, again, people take a look at is also ISO 9001, because again, you got to get familiar with the definitions, because that is going to be the new way of using those definitions in your QMSR. So
yeah,
that's another standard that you definitely have to take into consideration.
Definitions brings us to language, obviously. So, your recommendation is that we standardize language across the board.
Absolutely.
Okay, so a lot to think about, depending on which company, where they are in their own process, whether they are small or large, whether they already have 13485 or not, whether they risk-based thinkers to start with or not, whether they manage whether they do a good rigor with their management reviews. A lot to think about. If you had one piece of advice for someone preparing for QMSR right now, and let's make that someone a senior executive. They're a senior executive in a company that's preparing, and what should they be focusing on between now and February?
I am going to say that if by this date, you have not already taken the step to do your gap analysis and then make some of the changes, it's too late. If you end up getting inspected, the likelihood is that you will have issues that you have to explain yourself. However, if you are not that far away from getting close to getting things done the right way, then obviously complete your gap analysis. Like Beth said, make sure you trained everyone up to the executive management of the company on the new ways that there is QMSR, and then try to put a good plan, a quality plan in place to take step by step and get to the end point with appropriate timeline and appropriate resources. Because this is another thing. If you don't allocate resources to this and expect the same people that are doing the day-to-day job to do this work on top of it, it won't happen in a timely manner. It may happen, but it won't happen in a timely manner before you end up getting ready for an inspection.
So
That's
go
my
call the
recommendation.
project management office and get the best project manager on this and the right resources in the
Love it.
quality organization to work it, is what you would say. How
Exactly.
about
And I would add, as a suggestion is that using a risk-based strategy to make the decisions, you might also want to try doing a couple of mock audits throughout your organization, uh, from the new, not knowing the methodology that the FDA will use, but realizing that you're going to be looking at things differently. And that would be very much pertinent, particularly to those smaller companies. If you're a multi-site or the companies that only sell in the U.S., which these days there aren't that many. But and I guess the last question the last statement I would make is don't be afraid to ask questions. Not necessarily of the FDA, but find an expert to ask questions of. Whether it be an internal expert or if you're a part of a trade association, don't be afraid to ask the questions. Um, it- you know, Find somebody on LinkedIn or call us because we'll help you.
Yes, yes. And actually, what we have promised for some of our other customers, and we're going to make it public for everybody in January, we will have an easy way to contact us through our website and set up a little advisory call with one of you, hopefully. And then, if that means that there's something more that's needed, but at least just to have a little bit of advisory time with someone can sometimes help just to get organized in the thought process. I really appreciate you coming together with me. I know that this is the start of the rest of the year here and the holiday season for all of us. So happy New Year, happy 2026 to you, and happy 2026 to everybody who's watching this video. And we will do this transition. And I think that at the end of the day, though, I must say the direction is right. It may be a rocky road for some of us to get there,
Yeah,
but once we get there, it should ease things up in many different ways. So
absolutely.
thanks very much.